Yeah, they.
Dutton Pines State Park has been in state ownership for many decades, and I wrote it down from about 1937. In 1937, the Duttons sold this place to the state of Vermont for the purposes of a park and picnic shelter. I understand that they operated somewhat of a public place here before state ownership, and Ed can jump in, or anybody that knows more about the history than I do at any time. The park itself was built in between 37 and 39 by the Civilian Conservation Corps, and they put in these buildings, water system, leach field, who knows what it was really, the trail system. There's a parking lot down below that is actually grown with trees now, but wasn't an official sort of parking area. This park was opened in about 1940. It operated until the late 70s. It had at one time been a very busy place. Charlie, you want to talk a little bit about?
My family came up here quite often for picnics, especially when relatives came from, Charlestown, New Hampshire, or Pittsfield, Mass, or some of those places. And,
so it was actively used.
It was actively used
in that area.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Was there camping here, or was it just a day use area?
Down on the other road, there was a little place
campsites
where people could camp. Yeah, I don't know exactly how many campsites they had, but I'd say probably 8 or 10, maybe, just a small number. But people used to tent down there.
For me as a kid, it was a big deal.
Come on here. This is, I stopped here just to talk a little bit about the forest here. Like I said in there, this is a mix of plantations and native trees. This particular type of ground, which is obviously a sandy gravel, in the Connecticut River Valley, in the natural condition would typically be what's called the white pine, red oak, black oak forest type. There is very little of the red oak and black oak here at the moment. Mainly due to the fact that it was likely open and then planted. And you can see that over time the oaks will creep back into these sites. This is white oak and red oak, and the white pine typically would as well. These species all require disturbance to be reestablished. Without disturbance, this piece of ground will, over time, and I'm talking decades, would typically become more of a hemlock forest. But you can see we're a long ways from that. So this particular forest will stay pine, oak, and hardwood, barring some unforeseen circumstance, for many years. The understory is filled in dramatically, like a lot of places in Dummerston, the glossy buckthorn. And without some sort of control, this can become a dominant plant in the understory, and it will have an impact on the successive native species, and it will affect the long-term composition of the forest. Without management over the decades, we would probably develop a shrub tree forest, meaning that the shrub layer would become very dominant and the stocking of tree stems would become much more dispersed because seedlings have trouble reestablishing themselves against this competitor. The partridge berry is a very common species in the herb species in the white pine, red oak, black oak. Partridge berry, wild lily of the valley, low bush blueberry. These are really common components of this forest type. These particular ones here are benefiting from this brushwork that is done periodically. If we get into the shrubby sapling area, you will see less of this.
To work outdoors.
Well, if they don't want to do that, maybe we could find an old cemetery for them to clear.
Right. Black birch or sweet birch trees. This is a very common tree in the Connecticut River Valley, getting more so with every season. Very successful native tree. Puts out a prolific seed crop every year, unlike most forest trees that put out heavy seed crops unpredictably.
The other thing I noticed on it is even the young trees put out.
Yeah, they start at a young age.
Yep.
And typically not browsed by deer. The selective browsing by deer really has a huge role in which seedlings survive or dominate and which ones are repressed. And black birch is typically not browsed. So put all those things together and it tends to be really a very successful tree. We would be happy to grow black birch here, much more so than glossy buckthorn.
Right.
Can't you teach those deer to eat buckthorn?
You can't teach deer anything. So this was the rangers' quarters for many years. That's where we found the sign, actually, that I washed up and hung on the post for tonight. Ethan was here checking the buildings. Because there's been renewed interest in the park from the town, we have put it on our roster of places we try to remember to stop by and just keep an eye on. And Ethan was here a couple of weeks ago, and someone had broken into the building, and he was just checking to see what had occurred and found the sign. So it was actually serendipitous that we thought the sign had been long since disappeared. And we do plan to restore that original sign and put that up here officially next year. It's got a great character to it. It's somewhat different than our modern state park signs, but it does have a nice look, so we will use it again. This was like I said, the Rangers Cabin. And part of the management plan for Dutton Pines, based on the input from the Dummerston Historic Commission? Is that right? Society. We contracted with a local historical expert to do a assessment of the buildings and the infrastructure here, what we call a preservation plan. Tell us what can be salvaged and what can't be. We'll have to decide what to keep and what not to keep. The preliminary input we've gotten, and I'm getting this third hand because I have not actually talked to her. Ethan talked to the woman whose name is Lisa Papazian, who I've never met. She has been working on the assessment of the buildings. As someone pointed out, the picnic shelter is in remarkably good shape. It's obviously part of the reason is it sits on a cement pad that can't hurt, but it's also a very dry place. She feels that the Rangers' quarters can be conserved. The bathroom building is pretty much shot. There are some parts of it that she thinks are salvageable and would like us to salvage and use somewhere else. I don't think we're going to do that because we would spend $1,000 to salvage $100 worth of materials. And we can't afford to be impractical right now with the way our system is, nor should we be. And then the pump house, which we'll walk by, the old well and pump down below, is also going to likely come down because it's in such a state of disrepair. It's just like any building, when things aren't used, they tend to deteriorate. And we haven't had any active use of these buildings for 40 years. These forest stands, especially planted stands, which tend to be planted closer together with very little differentiation in growth as trees mature compared to natural stands, tend to be very densely stocked. The thing about trees is that when they get bigger, there's less room for everybody. And when a seedling or sapling stand starts out, there's 50 to 100,000 stems per acre. And when you get to a forest that's a mature forest with trees of this size, there should be about 300 trees per acre. For ideal growth, for forestry purposes, there would be about 150 stems per acre. This has been thinned several times. The last time we thinned this parcel was before my time, just before, I believe about 25 or 30 years ago. The experience wasn't that great, meaning the wood was fairly low quality. There was a lot of concern about all the different infrastructure pieces to avoid, and the foresters at the time lost their enthusiasm for doing another harvest here for several decades. The current plan calls for more of a hazard tree type treatment for this parcel. I did an assessment the other day to just get a true estimate of the volume that was here to decide whether we could do this commercially, meaning would someone pay us to thin this out, and the volume isn't here for that. given all the constraints about how the work would have to be done, and the quality of the trees is exceedingly poor from a timber standpoint. There tends to be a lot of decay. You can see they have very, very thin, wispy crowns. These are hard areas to work in because the results are unpredictable. So, and if you go out here, you'll see if we walked out there, there's a lot of dead standing trees. So what we are likely to do here is to start a program of annual hazard tree assessment and contracted removals to limit the hazard to people and the buildings that we have here. And a good example, I'm trying to see if there's a good example of a hazard tree we would want to take down right away. I don't see any here, but I'll point them out if I do. This is a white oak here, this three-pronged tree. This is one of my favorite trees. Found in very few places in Vermont, the Connecticut River Valley and the Champlain Valley. Prolific wildlife tree for acorn production, and beautiful lumber. We typically don't harvest white oak in our sales because we have so little of it. We generally keep them as legacy trees. So let's keep going down. This shaggy bark tree here is a black locust. It's native to the U.S., not considered native in Vermont. Most likely a remnant from years ago when this was actively a farm or used for agriculture. That was very typical for farmers in the Connecticut River Valley to plant black locusts for fencing. And there's still residuals of those trees hanging around. There's actually a site on the backside of Okemo Mountain, believe it or not, where there's an old farmstead and there's black locusts there growing. I don't know. It's really surprises me because it's like northern Russia on the backside of that mountain, but it grows.
Well, in Putney, there's a road called Black Locust Road, so there must have been some there once.
Well, I think that they planted them really early. Right now, we are basically in the middle of the easement area for Housing Foundation Incorporated. What that means is that that organization has certain rights in this area, but they do not own the land. So it's a deeded easement, and their rights are basically to place and use infrastructure to provide water. And we've recently re-upped their lease, and we modified their lease to specify that if and when they are done here, they have to remove all this infrastructure. That came out of the public meeting. I don't remember who. Someone at the public meeting from Dummerston said, "Hey, what are you guys going to do when they're done?" And we thought, "Oh, we hadn't really thought of that." So when we did their lease, we added it in.
What does that mean in terms of the wells themselves?
So we have a buffer zone around these wells that basically means, for instance, if for some reason we thought that there was a reason to have a bathroom on site, there's a huge part of this park that is you could no longer put a septic in, a leach field, because of the protection zone for the wells. But really, we just can't back over them, can't smash them. We can do forestry around them, but they have to be our primary concern, secondary to the trees, protecting these buildings. And it's part of the reason I doubt we'll do commercial harvesting here again, because we not only have the CCC structures, but we also have the water structures as well, and those things take precedence over trees on a 13-acre
But when you mentioned they have to remove the infrastructure, that doesn't include the wells.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, the wells have to be cut and capped.
Oh, really?
Yep. This is a red pine, also a tree that is native to North America, but not so much Vermont. Before it was used in plantings, you would find red pine in Vermont on the tops of, you still can, on the tops of very high dry ridges. If you've traveled north on Route 100 towards Plymouth, in the area where that flood damage was so bad and filled that whole meadow with rocks and gravel, if you look up on that ridge, there's a native red pine stand growing on that ridge. It tends to be competitive in really harsh environments. For native trees, they will grow where the site conditions suit them, but most importantly where they are competitive. And red pine is not competitive against other trees except in those high, dry, rocky northern ridges. It typically is a northern tree. It's a super tree in a lot of ways. It grows a lot of lumber, grows straight. They planted red pine in place of white pine years ago because it doesn't have problems with the white pine weevil, which is an insect that causes white pine to be forked and crooked. The red pine tends to grow straight.
Do they also use it for telephone poles?
Yes, that's that's the highest value use for red pine, for sure.
And did they find a lot of them in the CCC camps?
Yes, the CCC plantings that we have are typically red pine. Well, they're not typically anything. They're a mix of red pine, white pine, eastern larch, Norway spruce. I think that's Scotch pine, and I think that's those 5. Yeah.
When you saw them, they smell like carrots.
These do.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
There's actually a worm that grows in these that you can eat. I for years when I led school groups with my kids, and I always say, if anybody finds a worm in that red pine, I will eat it. And they never found one, but boy, did it get them out into the woods.
Everybody else will be with us. This is mostly everybody here talking is the idea. And Tim, who did most of the talking around the tour, is going to consented to do most of the listening this time. Is that right, Tim?
That's what I was hoping for,
Yeah. For those of you who were not part of the tour, this is Tim Morton, our host at the Dutton Pines State Park, representing the Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation of the state of Vermont. And there's a couple other people I want to introduce. First of all, you sat down, yes. Casey Muro, did I get your last name correctly?
Right.
He's our host for this part of the meeting. And
So we just wanted to say welcome to the Learning Collaborative, and we're thrilled to host this meeting and others. And I'll take 2 seconds to just tell you, if you don't already know, that the restrooms are up that end of the building. There's a big water bottle that produces hot or cold water, if you would care for any. And I wanted to mention an upcoming meeting on, if you're thinking as far as September 17th, there's an exciting event here, I think, around access to health insurance. That's sponsored by I had to ask Mike Merwicki to help me, the Department of Health Access of the state, and also by Putney Family Services. So if that's an issue for you, this will be a good meeting to learn quite a bit about it. But of course, tonight's a wonderful event too, and we welcome you. Thanks.
I'd like to recognize Mary Ellen Copeland, Chair of the Conservation Commission, co-sponsor for this meeting, along with Ed Anthes. They've been involved with this Dutton Pines issue for some time. Would either or both of you like to say a word or two about that interest that the Conservation Commission has?
We became involved in it when the state put out its proposed management plan for Dutton Pines and for the other state parks in this area. And I've been extremely pleasantly impressed by the way that the department has handled that process, that they were open to comments from those of us who live here, that they really welcomed them and acted on them and incorporated them into their plan. So contrary to some planning processes that I've been involved with, this one was, it was really refreshing to see that they responded well to good suggestions, and Tim's presence here with us tonight is an example of that. So thank you very much.
Excellent. And also I'd like to recognize a few people here who were involved with the Transition Dummerston. We call ourselves the initiating group. I'm not quite sure where that name came from. First of all, Transition Dummerston got involved with Dutton Pines because of this lady over here. Ruth Barton was part of our retreat last February, March? January. Ah,
Transition Dummerston is part of a worldwide transition town movement. Some of you may be familiar with it. There's a Transition Putney, Transition Brattleboro, a few other towns in the area. And it is a movement that builds local communities to work on becoming more resilient as we face peak oil, climate change, and economic insecurity. And it's looking at real neighborhoods and towns pulling together to be prepared for what may be coming, what we have to face. And in that process is building community. And Dutton Pines seems like such an underused resource where people could have community gatherings. I did go over and talk with people at the mobile home park across the road, and everybody there pretty much said they would love to have it fixed up so that they could go over there and have family picnics and cookouts. That was sort of the number one use that they felt they would like to see. So as Transition Dummerston, we really like to respond to what comes out of the community. We're not going to come in and dictate what we're going to do with Dutton Pines or in any way think we know what's best there, but we want to draw out of people who are interested, like everybody here, what your interests are, what you'd like to see possibly happen there. We're going to have a chance to just kind of brainstorm, not worrying about laws and money, what we'd like to see there, and then we'll get more practical after that. But just to see what people really want to build community and use this wonderful natural resource that's there. And if you have any questions about transition towns or transition Dummerston, feel free afterwards to talk to any of the initiating group here.
what impressed you as we walked around the park? What dreams do you see, using your word, dreams, potential do you see that's not being used?
The loop. And I enjoyed walking that loop, and I had no idea that land was back there. And I appreciated the comments about the different trees and the history along the way, and I thought how nice it would be if it was like an interpretive trail with a little, not big plaques, but little tiny,
Information.
little pieces of information that you could read as you walked.
That would be a great education tool that the school right up the road could.
Yes, a scout troop or a school or whatever.
We'll have to mention that to the science teacher at the Dummerston School.
I actually stopped about a month ago because I've driven by that for so many times over the years, and was actually nervous, just sort of cautious about going alone, sort of exploring on my own. And I was first struck by the fact that it was clean. I mean, there wasn't litter or anything, and how unique the buildings were, and the stone craft, the chairs and the different things. It sort of reminded me of the Conservation Corps projects that they had. Is it? It's basic. About there. And so that part is also a historical piece. Then, I think that would be great to share. But I like the idea that the people across the road at the trailer park could, or just people in the neighborhood would stop once we sort of made it have a good feeling about it.
Well, I guess I'd like to find a way to involve the Career Center, not only in doing work to keep it up, but in managing it somehow. I think that's a major question. Who is going to take responsibility for looking after it, and that involves some funding too, and so forth. That's a big question.
Excellent suggestion. Jeanette.
Well, I must admit that I've lived here for 40 years and I've never walked back there before. And when we first moved here, it seemed to me that almost every weekend there were people picnicking in the shelter as we drove by. I didn't want to picnic because we lived with no electricity and no water, and why would I want to ever go on a picnic or camping? But I think that that the issue is finding somebody who's going to take it on, and I don't know if that's the town of Dummerston or the Transitions, but clearly, as Tim pointed out, it's the state resources to do anything with it are pretty limited, and it's pretty low on their priority list, rightly or wrongly. But so, who's gonna? I don't know. I mean, I'm curious to hear if people have ideas of who the Career Center, the Conservation Commission. You can take it on. Olga said she wants to live in the cabin in the summertime. So.
This evening, but I've driven past it many times, and especially in the winter when I'm driving through, especially after fresh snow, I think, why aren't my snowshoes here? And I know I could just do half an hour, jump back in the car and go about my merry way. It looks idyllic in the snow. I'm like Bill, I'm fascinated by how many people have some sense of where this place came from, and again, their memories of this place. I like the idea that Ruth has some stories to tell about it, and I like the idea that it's the conservation course. So what are the underpinnings of history, and where does this go forward? So it's trying to just raise its profile and find out how it finds its way into the affection of more people locally by having a direct experience there.
I'm Kenny, and I own the KOA campground not too far from there. And I have visited the park, especially in the wintertime when my dog Brea was alive. She and I would walk there quite often, and I often got the sense, boy, this would make a great sledding hill. If with a little bit of grooming, it may be a great place for that. On the flip side, I do want to address the funding issue. I recently got my tax bill for the town of Dummerston, and it went up $700 this year. Taxes to the town are my second largest expense behind electricity. If something is going to be done with Dutton Pines, I do not want to see the town pay for it. The town does not have the money. People in the town do not have the money for this. So I think it would behoove everybody to think long and hard about where funding for this resource, its use, would come from, because I don't think it should come from taxes in the town.
When I walked in there, I haven't been there for probably 50 years. And the last time I was there was
You were 2 years old?
Well, thank you very much, but I'm out of money. It was really kind of sad in a way because it's not being utilized anymore. We used to go there for picnics a lot when we were first married, and family would come up and we would go there and have picnics. So it's kind of sad not to see such a great resource being utilized and being used just for that simple thing of picnic. I can understand why it doesn't have a great attraction as a state park. It doesn't have water, and it doesnn't have, all the things that kids like to have available. No big long hiking trails, no mountain to climb, but it's got its own uniqueness. But I really like the place. I'd like to see us use it some.
My family in the 40s, we would picnic there very often. And so it has some sentimental value to me. My family from Pittsfield, Mass, from Farmington, Connecticut, and from Charlestown, New Hampshire used to use it with us. I think we're going to have to try to find some way to get some volunteer work to do some things. I don't think we can do everything.
Mary Ellen?
I like it very much. I think it would be a nice thing to have a park. I see some possibilities for handicapped accessible, a place where people could, use it if they were in wheelchairs and somebody had to push them. We could make it clear enough for that. For older people to get out into the woods, feels kind of safe there. It's not too far out into the wilderness. I think it'd be very nice to, if we can figure out a way, I think we're gonna have to be creative. It'd be a great place for people to take little kids, groups of little kids. Maybe we could think of some simple kinds of playground equipment, but I'd like to see it saved and made into a resource for the community, however we figure out to do that.
I'm really touched by the history of it, that Myron Dutton first started planting white pines there in 1887 and did it over some years, and then planted red pines 10 or 20 years later, and the CCC continued that. I think that having those structures that were built by basically kids who didn't have any work, whose most of their paychecks were sent home to the family and was used for the family to support itself while they were off in this camp building, the state park, and then it's lasted all this time, even with benign neglect, because of the materials they used, the care they took with it, because it's a dry site. And I would like to see it be less scary. I drove by it for years before I finally walked in, and could never quite figure out, even from the road, what that building was back there. Was it open? Was it closed? Was there somebody living there? Once in a while I'd see somebody back in there. So I think that one of the things that would be helpful is if it was more open, and you could, it more fit people's idea of what a small park is, at least in the upper part along Route 5, that we could increase the visibility to the, certainly to the shelter, maybe also to the ranger's cabin, and doing some of that might make it both more attractive for people to use during the day, and less likely that people are going to use it for activities that we prefer didn't go on in the park.
So Ed, when you say more open, you mean that 0 to 30 feet
Yes.
level, not...
Yes, the understory, so that we could, so that people could actually see the stone structures, the campfire structures, the memorial to the head of the CCC that's there. And I would like to have, as someone said, as Jane said, both interpretive things, both about the trees, like you were talking about, and the small plants, but also about the CCC. One thing that I have not gotten to and would love if somebody would is to go to the Brattleboro Reformer files and look in 1937, 38, 39 when they were constructing it, or 1940 when Governor Aiken came down and opened up the park. There must be information there, but I haven't been able to find it online. I think you have to go to where those files are kept in, I think, the Brattleboro Library. But
It may be the Historical Society.
Bill and Bess may have been there when the governor came. Governor Aiken. You know what I see when I walk through there? I see a zip line. Going down that steep hill. Mike, some of you know that I grew up just over in Winchester, and in my youth, we came over to Brattleboro pretty often, but I don't think we ever drove north of Brattleboro, and Dummerston was, never heard of it before. But after traveling many other places in between, I came back exactly 15 years ago next month to start retirement in this area. And one of the first things we did was drive up Route 5, headed to check out the grammar school in Dummerston for my youngest daughter. And we were looking for a place to picnic. And there was Dutton Pines State Park. So we stopped there and we picnicked. That was our very first introduction to Dummerston and the road to Putney. And that was in 1998. So I guess in the meantime, since then, I've kind of wondered, what happened, how come I don't even recognize where it was anymore, et cetera, et cetera. So it'd be kind of nice to have some kind of resurrection, and maybe out of this meeting will come the genesis of a group that can kind of work on that.
You know, I've lived here almost 30 years. I had never been in the park, so I'd like to see it, you know, cleaned up and more inviting, and safety is a huge issue there. The sense of safety, entering that. When I went around and talked with people across the street in the mobile home park, they talked about a lot of homeless people living there, and I know, you know, the sheriff's department or whatever is working on trying to, you know, deal with that issue. But I think that's a major thing that has to be dealt with, because almost everybody mentioned that they're not comfortable going over there because they're close enough. They know that sometimes somebody camps out there, or they're, you know, drinking parties or whatever that happen out there. So we have to improve the safety, which means we need some kind of patrolling, whether it's a volunteer group or we get the sheriff's department checking it more often. I think that's a huge piece. And the other thing that most of the people I talked to just mentioned, they would like to use it for picnics, just to go over and have family gatherings. Just everybody said that. That's my feeling. I keep hearing it here. So if that area, when you come in, if it was cleaned up a little bit, not taking the tall trees out, but the smaller growth underneath, and putting in picnic tables, that would make it obvious that it's a place you can come and have a picnic. I think that would be a fairly simple thing. We would need some sort of bathroom, whether that's a porta potty or something like that. If that could be something, I don't know if the state could pay for that as part of the routinely coming in and changing that. So I think that would help it feel more usable for people. And then I went there for the first time with Ed and Bill a few weeks ago to tour it, and I don't know, I just had this strong feeling I'd love to see a walking labyrinth in there where people, similar to what's up at Manitou, where there's just quiet places where people can go, and a labyrinth would just be a very simple thing to put in. It wouldn't cost anything. We'd get a group of volunteers to do it. But anyway.
I think, in thinking about this meeting, it seems to me that this is the only public parkland between the Massachusetts line and north end of Rockingham on Route 5 that's accessible. And it just strikes me as a wonderful resource. But thinking of it in terms of education, because that's most of what I work on, it has lots of potential for kids, certainly, in looking at forestry and looking at history, social studies as well. It also has potential, because we happen to run a lot of courses for teachers here, as a resource within science courses or other things for teachers to take a look at and consider how they could use public property that may be closer to wherever they happen to be teaching. So it's a resource in that regard too. I think of the CCC aspect of it as particularly interesting, and we recently visited Townsend State Park, which has a really nice exhibit including photographs of what the CCC crews did there. And I was thinking about that in terms of Dutton Pines. I realize it's not realistic to assume there could suddenly be an exhibit there, but wouldn't it be neat if there were at some point that would tell a story beyond just what's there right now?
I agree with a lot of what's been said for having people partner depending on their interests. Grammar school or the elementary school doing science and hikes over there, whether scouting might be interested in it. In the winter, if there was someone who would go through to groom a trail, there could be cross-country skiing. And I would imagine that if there were set hours for this, there could be hot chocolate available. A group, Friends of Dutton Pines State Park, could be there to make the hospitality quite warm and an enjoyable winter experience. And as far as funding, I think there could be patrons who support this. And again, for the people like the Learning Collaboratives, it has a educational interest, the elementary school, and then citizens who could be patrons. It seems there could be a way to make this sustainable.
I grew up, for those of you who don't know, right next door in the big farmhouse, and Dutton Pines has always been there. And at some point I went to a meeting, I think it was down in Guilford, and the state fella scared the pants off of me down there. They kind of demolished the sweet tree or whatever it was, state park they had down there in Guilford, ruined that. And I was afraid they was going to ruin this one, sell it off or something. So I come home and I called who I call. I called Bill Schmidt over here. I said, my golly, Bill won't like doing things up there. So I called him, and he and Mary Ellen and Ed and a bunch of us showed up there one day and walked around, and the place looked kind of familiar. But when I was a kid, I remember we used to go there just like Charlie's family. Our family would go there for picnics, or Grange groups or whatever groups would go there for picnics. And it was in use almost every weekend in the summertime. There was some group in there having a picnic. And I think if you could get some group of people, like, say, Friends of Dutton Pines State Park or whatever, to kind of police the place, if you put up a sign that said, if you want to use this place, we request donations to help us keep it usable. And hire a porta potty for the summer months. And, people know that it doesn't have hot and cold running water and coffee machines and internet stations every 5 feet and things like that. And they could go there and have a good time. And personally, I'd like to see weddings there. It's such a lovely spot.
What would be the advantage of it being owned by the town instead of by the state? And I'm not talking about the town buying it. I don't know if there's an advantage to people, to the psychological impact of people thinking this is, we have the Putney Town Forest and people use it all the time, and there's volunteers and there's groups that go there and work on it. And if there's a psychological advantage to having it be Dummerston Dutton Pines instead of State of Vermont Dutton Pines.
For the last couple of years, there's been a lot of reluctance on the part of the select board to taking on any expense that would be associated with it.
Does the
I don't know.
Like liability and that kind of stuff?
Yeah.
Okay.
We do have the town park prospect hill, which gets mild use in the various seasons. It's such a sort of unassuming place. It's not like there's a grand vista or it's the landing on the river, or it's kind of a subtle site.
The Prospect Hill is a parallel. That was gifted to the town, and the Conservation Commission, for its part, has occasional work days, tries to keep the trails up, the top clear, and so on. When the donation of land was made, there was a cash gift along with it, so there is a Prospect Hill fund in the town budget. The select board, when they were first presented the idea of accepting it, did not like it. It took a year or two for them to agree to put it to the town in 1974, I think it was, and the town at a special meeting accepted the gift of Prospect Hill. That's a 35-acre parcel. No, it's conceivable that the town could own it. The Conservation Commission, there is a recreation board. I don't know how active that is. Probably not at all.
Well,
but it could get some people who might partner with the Conservation Commission and look after it. There also could be, as you said, a Friends of Dutton Pines State Park responsibility.
Well, obviously, our group this evening is not going to decide the future of the park, and particularly not the administrative part, but it is good to get these options, these potential models on the table and into discussion. So, what concrete steps can we take going forward? I've heard 2 or 3 people mention the possibility of Friends of Dutton Pines State Park. Is that something we should be thinking about forming such a group?
Well, if there were a group, the Friends of Dutton Pines, I think there could be outreach to high schools because of the need to do community service. And so that there could be some kind of trail maintenance that kids would do.
Earlier, Jeanette mentioned the Putney Town Forest, which was adjacent to the school, and there was a core group who tried to organize some things after the land was gifted to the town. And one of the things that I helped do was coordinate getting an intern from Antioch and moving some of our after-school programs in Putney to take an active role into trail building and maintenance. And it's one of the things that could perhaps even be incorporated into some of the curriculum at the school. But I think those kind of coordination of efforts can bring some people power into play here.
SIT has a master's program in sustainable development, and I believe there's a urine project now that's been being used for agriculture and fertilizing. And when you think about sanitation and toilets at the park, I'm just wondering whether there could be a project that uses some kind of urine collection into charcoal and also a composting toilet. So it doesn't have to be plumbed and interfere with the wells. There may be this connection through the programs either at Antioch or at SIT.
How about the security issue? Is there a role for the community in that, Margaret?
I think just using the park, clearing it a little bit, and promoting use. I think just more activity there will create more security.
Mm-hmm. I think opening it up
in a very natural way. If there are more people there, there's going to be less inclination to go hide out in the woods or do something inappropriate there. I see people sort of parked along the road before you come to the Dummerston turnoff when you're leaving Brattleboro, and people are stopping there having lunch. If they just went up the road another mile, they could stop and have lunch and a walk at the park.
Beverly?
I have a suggestion and then a question. One thing, my memory serves me, there's a lot of dog waste that accumulates there, so an easy thing would be simple signage saying, do not let your dog go here, clean up after your dog, whatever. But that would be, I think, one easy step to cleaning it up.
Even having a supply of plastic bags.
But then who's going to maintain it, the expense, blah, blah. So even the sign might be enough to stop some people from not walking with a bag anyways. And then my question is for Tim. What does the state want to have happen with that property?
We went through an extensive planning process several years ago for the 4 southern Vermont parks. We call it the Brattleboro Management Unit, Sweet Pond, Dutton Pines, Fort Dummer, Molly Star. based on our ideas, our feelings about the suitability of it for an actual park, quote unquote, and some of the feedback we got at the town level and the public involvement, we've stated many times now, we view Dutton Pines under the management of the Vermont Department of Forests and Parks as a passive recreation area with limited day use. We have no interest in making it a fee park, which most of our parks are fee places. We've continued as a non-fee, passive recreation, maintain the forest to such a degree that there aren't obvious hazards from trees, and conserving the buildings that we can for the time being should someone find a use for them, and maintain the place in such a way so that at some future date, if a community organization or a community did want to have a more active role, there's still something decent there. But it will be a very low-key effort. We have 50,000 acres in this district. We have a dozen or more parks, many of which have tremendous infrastructure needs and take up a lot of our efforts. So I think what you'll see from us is more activity, but nothing outrageous. We have some other agreements. We have one at Molly Stark with the Wilmington Trail Association and the Hogback Mountain Association to do some, I guess, cooperative trail maintenance. They have trails coming in both sides and going to Mount Olga. And I'm sure there's more. I just can't think of them off the top of my head, but it does happen. It's not the typical model. Typically, the parks are self-sustaining to some degree and are run as a fee recreation area.
When you have these community arrangements, it needs to be with an officially recognized organization.
It needs to be an organization. We often do a simple memorandum of agreement. Sometimes if there's more activity, it's more involved. We might have a license that where we would require liability insurance and that sort of thing. We just did one. I'm trying to think what town it was. Oh, I just recently did a cross-country ski agreement in Sharon. We did it through the Conservation Commission so that the town, and we did it with a license so that the town could provide liability insurance for the trail system. And that trail system is actually being actively improved, and it's sitting right in the heart of an area that we do fairly intensive plantation forestry, and we've been able to make it work so that we can do the forestry and have the ski trail. We have a cooperative agreement with the Downer Camp Association that runs the children's camp at Downer, and that seems to work very well. They basically lease the space and they run the park, run the campground. So it does happen.
Wanted me to, I could ask the Conservation Commission if they wanted to, have maybe a Friends of Dutton Pines committee that could include lots of people from the community that will be under the auspices of the Conservation Commission in the same way that we provide some oversight to Prospect and the rain garden that's down at the bottom. So I could ask them how they would feel about that.
It didn't come up yet, but I know from contact with the Dummerston Historical Society, who had a special event about Dutton Pines some time ago. Is that correct?
Oh, Tim came.
Not Ethan.
Oh.
We alternate.
You're up. There's a lot of information on Dutton Pines, its history, people connected with it. Tim shared a lot, and others know a lot. We've got a lot of writers in Dummerston. It would really be good if somebody wrote the story of Dutton Pines, pulled this material together in a little brochure. That would really be useful and would help get the word out and
well, I believe there's going to be a start in that direction.
Well, the Commons article will be a great start.
And you've got a great resource of writers and documentarians in the middle school at Dummerston. Middle school kids are incredible about doing projects like this, and will write readable stuff or work on a video.
Yeah.
Which teacher there should we contact, or just go to the principal?
I think starting with the principal would.
Well, if we had some kind of a group that comes out, either sponsored by the Conservation Commission or any other mechanism, are the people here who would like to be part of that exercise going forward? Ruth, of course. Ed? Charlie, Beverly?
In the winter.
So much
Yeah. I know that we do have.
I got those down. I've written down Charlie, Ruth, myself, Beverly, Casey. Did I miss anybody? Okay.
Me.
Bill and G.
Yeah,
Great.
We will commit to doing more down there. Like I said before, I think that we can easily do brush clearing. We have a chipper. We do what we call work days periodically, where we get a bunch of us together and we all tackle one project and get it done in a day, and we can do that sort of work there. So we will be more active to some degree. Any plans that I think that are made for Dutton Pines that are presented as a department, this is my advice to you, should be well thought out and carefully argued and demonstrate some capacity for follow-through. We do occasionally get started on things and expend time and get left holding the bag, and we don't really want to do that. So I think that taking longer to come up with a really solid proposal that you have the capacity to deliver on is better than putting something together quickly to feel like you've done something that maybe you can't actually fulfill. But we do welcome proposals from the town and the community. We intend to keep the park. We intend to keep it available to people and work with you folks to do that.
Contribute a few words from the Dummerston history. This was retrieved from Myron Dutton's scrapbook, for whom it's named, from the Vermonter, the state magazine in 1922. Down in the southeastern part of the state, I am told, there is a more convenient stopping place, a handsome grove of white pines on the farm of Myron F. Dutton in East Dummerston. The grove covers an area of 5.5 acres of gravel upland and has a stand of about 1,300 trees, 800 of which were transplanted. 480 small pines from 2 to 3 feet set in November 1889 and 90. 480 are still living, so that's 30 years later, an excellent survival rate.
There's a stump or two of some of those trees right around the shelter there.
Mm-hmm. It is an ideal place for auto and picnic parties, as the ground is level, free from undergrowth, stumps or stones, and covered with a thick carpet of pine needles. And then ends with a quote, "I'd like to meet that man, hear the sighing of the wind in that grove, and sniff the invigorating atmosphere. Say, it makes me relax now."
Thank you all for being here and thank you for participating.
I want to have a picnic here this weekend. Who do I call?